Hi, I'm Ted Haftegabber, founder and producer of Live Talks Los Angeles. Thanks for joining us. Since we started over a decade ago, we have brought you hundreds of conversations with storytellers, writers, actors, musicians, humorists, chefs, and thought leaders in business and science. You can watch and hear most of these in our YouTube channel and our podcast. For details, visit livetalksla.org. And now, here's the show you've tuned in to see. We welcome Shaka Senghor and DeVon Franklin to Live Talks Los Angeles. They'll discuss Shaka's book, Letters to the Sons of Society, A Father's Invitation to Love, Honesty, and Freedom. Shaka is the best-selling author of Righting My Wrongs, Life, Death, and Redemption in an American Prison. He's a leading voice on criminal justice reform, a tech investor, a lecturer at universities, and the head of diversity, equality, and inclusion at TripActions. Senghor is a former MIT Media Lab Director's Fellow, a former fellow in the inaugural class of the Kellogg Foundation Community Leadership Network, and a member of Oprah Winfrey's SuperSoul 100. DeVon is a producer and best-selling author. He is the award-winning producer of the upcoming Flaming Hot movie and the hit film Breakthrough. And he serves as a vice president of the Board of Governors of the Academy of Motion Pictures, Arts, and Sciences. His other books include Live Free, The Success Commandments, and Produced by Faith. Welcome to all of you attending, and take it from here, DeVon.
Hey, what's up, y'all? I'm DeVon Franklin. I am honored to be here with my brother from another, Shaka Senghor. Let me tell you, we met years ago through Oprah. Through Oprah's SuperSoul 100. And the thing about my brother, so I'm going to talk about you like you ain't here, is the moment you meet him, you feel like you already know him. And that's how our brotherhood has been. And I'm excited that we can be here with Live Talks LA to talk about your new book, Letters to Sons of Society. Yeah. This book, my brother, blessed me. I'm the middle child of three boys. Oh, wow. My father died when I was 9 years old of a heart attack when he was 36. Wow. And he was an alcoholic, most of his life. And most of my memories of him were him being, inebriated. And, his brother, my uncles were alcoholics. My grandfather and grandmother on his side were alcoholic. Wow. So reading your book was healing to me because it made me think about what it would have been like if my father had written me a letter that I was able to read while he was still alive. What was the motivation to do a book where it's literally letters to both of your sons, to Jay and Sekou? Tell us about the motivation and the inspiration behind why you chose this way to write this book.
Yeah, that's a great question, man. And, I personally think letters are the greatest way to get to intimacy. Mm-hmm. And I got that from my dad. I was incarcerated for 19 years, and for that 19 years, me and my dad exchanged letters. And those letters grew me. They challenged me. They allowed me to free myself because I was able to speak my truth to my dad. And to his credit, man, my dad stood in every moment, every challenge, every idea. And, that back and forth exchange really helped shape how I see the world. It helped shape how I see fatherhood. I already had kind of like an idea of who I thought my dad was. It's kind of shaped like that. Boyhood, dad is the superhero. My dad was in the Air Force. And I remember when he used to come home with his Air Force uniform on, he used to look taller than life to me, Right. My dad is actually not that tall, but, right. it's the kind of hero way that we see our dads. And as our life began to kind of fall apart and, him and my mom separated and divorced, all the things that was going on in the household, and I found myself in the streets. And so when I went to prison, me and my dad, we started this correspondence. And he's a beautiful letter writer. He brings you into his world. He talks about what was happening. And so just as I was thinking about what is the next stories that I want to tell, what's important, I was looking at everything that's happening in the world and looking at these experiences with my two sons. And originally the idea came to me because I was thinking about the narrative around black men and black boys specifically. Yes. And I mentored young men across the country, outside of the country.
Mm-hmm.
And initially I was like, I'm going to just write letters to all the different kind of sons I know. My hip-hop sons, my creative sons, my entrepreneurial sons. And I started thinking about it, and I was like, between the world of my oldest son, Jay, who's now 30, and my youngest son, Sekou, who's now 10, exists all of my sons. All of the young men I've been mentored, the boy and my friends that are adults, the boy and myself. And so I started writing letters, you know, just long form, just, you know, in my energy, in my space, and like, this is what I want to share with my boys. So
wow. Well, I want to go back for a moment, because we'll get into some of the, you know, letters you write, and I picked out some moments I want to ask you about. But I want to go back to the moment that you're in solitary confinement. Do you remember the first letter you got from your father? And like what that experience was of being in solitary confinement and then that letter being delivered?
Yeah, so the longest stretch I did in solitary was 4.5 years. And I remember this moment of saying to myself that I'm never getting out of here. Because that's all the guards and the administration was telling me, like, you're never leaving this place. Yeah. And so I wrote my dad first. And I wrote this letter and just kind of told him what happened, why I was in solitary. And I remember writing to my dad and said, you know, at this point, I don't know if I'm ever getting out of prison. Yeah. And what I would encourage you to do is to move on with life, you know, love on the family. I know how to do time, you know, and I don't want y'all to be in prison with me. Yeah. And my dad wrote me this letter back, and he said to me, and this was a pivotal moment in our relationship. He said, son, I don't have a judgment on what landed you in solitary confinement. I don't understand that world. I'm not in that world. But what I do is understand that I know you're always going to lean into your humanity. You're going to stand up for what you believe, and whether I agree with it or not, I respect it, and I respect you as a man, and I will never leave your side. And that moment was just like, it just let all of the tension I felt around the environment, it just dissipated. And I felt love in this deep, deep way, and I really began to understand what unconditional love looks like, you know. And so, you know, over the years, my dad has seen me in every iteration of incarceration. Yeah. You know, I remember a moment, and when I think about it, like to this day, it just, you know, it's heartbreaking if I think about what it must have felt like for him to see me walking in shackles, you know, up to the cage where he can't touch me, can't comfort me, and he has to sit in that as a dad and not be able to protect and to, you know, nurture, you know. And so there's all these moments that I think back to, and I read his letters now, and I read them when I was writing this book, and it was like, wow, like I understand him even deeper now, because like I'm a grown man, you know? I was a boy on that journey, you know, and so now I'm a grown man, I'm a dad, you know, I'm one of the leaders in the family, and I really understand him at a deep, deep level and just have a profound appreciation for all the complexities of who he is as a man.
About how many letters do you have from your father? When I was looking in the book, you mentioned that, you know, here at your house in L.A. that you still have all the letters. But how many do you think?
I probably have about 50 to 60 of them. So one of the things that happened is, you know, when I was in prison, they would shake down my cell and force me to send things home. So at one point, I had just like a bag of letters I ended up sending home, and they ended up getting lost in the flood at my dad's home. But I was able to still have, I still probably got about 50 or 60 letters. And they're still in the same envelopes from different prisons I was at. So sometime when I'm reading, I go back to that little boy and just think like, man, you know, who my dad was and how he showed up. And we just don't hear the journey of dads as nurturing support during these tougher moments. But my dad was my person for 19 years straight.
Wow, that's powerful. I had highlighted here when he wrote, as you wrote, I'll never leave your side. Yeah. Isn't that so important? Absolutely. You know, as men, to be able to give that type of reassurance to other men. What I love about the book is literally that, for me, that might as well be the thing. Because anyone reading it, whether your father's alive, your father's not around, any man that reads this book, you are letting them know, I'll never leave your side.
Absolutely.
Because I'm giving you this knowledge to help you navigate this journey. And when you read these letters, to the point you made earlier, what I love is that even though you're writing to your sons, it feels like you're writing to all of us. Yeah. And you feel that intimacy and that closeness, which I found very powerful. Why is it in a world of texting and emailing and DMing, letter writing seems old-fashioned?
Yeah.
What was it about letter writing and the power of that made you say, no, it's got to be letters. It can't be, I don't want to do a book of text.
right. Yeah, I mean, the experience, obviously being inside prison, like that was my main form of communication for years. I wrote people all over the world. I wrote, newspapers, and I would share articles and essays that I had written. And I had pen pals, people who would find my writing and just write to me. But it was, for me, like some of the greatest works of our times, that's really informative and instructive, was written in the form of letters. I think about the letters Nelson Mandela wrote from prison and how enlightening those letters was. You think about, Martin Luther King Jr.'s, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s, like his letter from the Birmingham jail, and like just that intimacy, that emotion that he really shared, and it was just honest and raw, And so you think about scripture. A lot of those are letters,
absolutely. So, most of them, especially in the New Testament, letter to the Church of Corinth,
absolutely.
Letter to the Philippians. I mean, all that is letter writing.
Yeah, and so there's that intimacy and that connection, and I think it's just like for me, when I would sit down and write these letters, I thought about my boys and all their iterations. I thought about their faces, their smiles. I thought about them sitting in a chair and reading, like, these are the words from my dad's soul. These are the words from my dad's heart. And that was just, I was like, I can't do this any other way, because I think that's the easiest way for me to get to the truth is when it's very intimate and very personal.
And you do that. Yeah. So speaking of intimacy and personal, okay, there's so much I want to break down from this book. Yeah. The first one, though, man, if you could just please help everyone watching right now, the trip to the gas station letter.
Yeah.
First of all, tell us that story, and why did you choose that letter? As the foundation for the entire book?
Yeah, so when I walked out of prison, I came home with this idea of who I was as a father. And it was based on my dad bringing my son up to visit me throughout my incarceration and, writing letters and phone calls. And in between those letters and phone calls and visits, there was the story I was creating about who I was as a dad. I would write these very instructive letters. Here, do this, don't do that, blah, blah, blah. Because I was just seeing legions of black boys and brown boys and poor white boys coming through prison. And I'm like, I got to save him. I got to save him. What I didn't account for is that I was trying to save an old version of myself.
Wow.
I was writing to myself because his reality was different from my reality. And so, over the years, I kind of developed more of a mentor mentality and thought that's what fatherhood was. So when I came home, I had this idea, we're going to hit the ground running, we're going to get out here, we're going to hustle these books, we're going to build this business, we're going to ride off into the sunset, father and son. And what I didn't stop to do was ask my son, did he want to go on yet another journey? See, I had already taken him on a journey to incarceration and to having an absent dad and to having moments of wondering what it was about him that made his reality what it was, where his dad wasn't present. And he hadn't asked to sign up for that journey. And so I come out and I'm like, let's go, let's do this, let's do that. And it created, tension. And the way that I thought was the smart way to disrupt the tension was to overcompensate. And so it was like, I got a little bit of money, let's go shopping. You need something, here's money. But that wasn't a relationship. It was all transactional. And he and I both began to treat it transactional. When he would call, I didn't want to take the calls. When we did talk, it's, hey, Dad, can I get some money? And so one day he asked me for some money to get his license, and I gave it to him. I gave it to my stepmom. I was like, give it to him. And then he calls me days later, and he's like, yo, I need some money to get my license. I'm like, I just gave you money to get your license, And he just kind of went off like, don't be talking to me like this, blah, 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 this, that, and other. And I'm like, well, you're asking for my money, so I'm entitled to get an accounting.
Right.
This is what I learned from my dad, right?
Exactly.
And so we get into this heated argument, and he threatens to stab me. And in that moment, all the things that I thought I had healed from, the trauma, I grew up in a very violent environment from the streets to prison, it all came rushing back. You know, and it's like, okay, you want to stab me? I'm gonna show you what it's like being on the big yard. You know, I'm coming from the big yard where stabbings happen every day. You know, this is prison. This is how it goes down. And so I basically was like, I got to take care of him. You know, one of us got to go. We can't coexist, you know. And so I called his mother, and, you know, his mother, she knew me from the street. She knew the street side of me. And I tell her exactly what I'm going to do. You know, I'm going to go get him, put him in the trunk, take him over to this neighborhood, and that's where they're going to find him. And
You told her just like that?
just like that.
And that was, you were like serious. It was not, there was no, you weren't joking around. You were serious.
Yeah.
Okay.
Like, this is what it is. Like, he threatened me. I have to treat him like I would treat any other threat. I got to solve for the threat, right?
Wow.
And, you know, I called my dad. You know, my dad tried to talk me down. I called a couple of my guys, and one of my guys, Calvin Evans, brother I grew up with in prison. We met in prison. We met in solitary, to be exact. And he was like, man, like Shaka, you got to think about where he's at. You know, he's hurt. He's a little boy hurt. He's having a temper tantrum. It's just, he's a boy. He's having a temper tantrum. And so, you know, I calmed down, let it go. And shortly after that, I get a call that my son has been found dead in the neighborhood exactly where I said he would be. And, you know, I'll let the readers figure out, you know, the rest of the story, but that was a monumental moment in our life. And the reason that I started the book with that chapter is because I really wanted people to understand what happens when a father's absent, what happens when somebody reemerges in society from prison with all of this PTSD, all of this trauma, and what happened when a child is dealing with daddy wounds, and how those two worlds can converge in the most catastrophic way. And that's what, you know, literally happened to us in our family.
Man, listen, I can't wait for the readers to finish that story, because it is a letter worth finishing. Now, I want to talk about because when you're talking about especially that particular moment, you know, in you had done, you know, in prison and being incarcerated, healing, right? You had been writing these letters, you had been, you know, emoting, but then you're put in this situation with your son, where the circumstance reveals how much healing there is or isn't.
Absolutely.
How did you handle the mirror of that situation, reflecting that there was more healing that needed to take place? How did you deal with that?
It was a mixture of things, you know. One, I was afraid, because I was afraid that I knew I was comfortable with going back to prison, and that was like terrifying to think that yet again I would be leaving another son in society to be raised by my family and whoever was going to take up that responsibility. I was shocked, you know, at how much was still there. And I was relieved that I had people I can turn to that can help me reconcile all the things that I was feeling, and that I was willing to, you know, seek the therapy and recognize, you know, like, this isn't just PTSD, it's compounded PTSD. What happened is I got shot when I was 17 years old, and I had never got any treatment for that. I had never saw, you know, any type of mental health therapist. And 16 months later, I was in prison.
Wow.
And so I went from, you know, this extreme trauma to my body to now the trauma of my living experience, which was very volatile. And, you know, I did hard prison time. It wasn't like, you know, I went in and I was a model, you know, person inside. I got into all type of trouble. I was, you know, I did a total of 7 years of solitary. You know, I got into fights and I got into assaulted officers and all the things. And so it was just violence upon violence upon violence until the latter stages of my, you know, incarceration started getting down in security level. And so I had never reconciled that this is at the extreme level of human violence, and that there needs to be real healing, you know, and that it has to be rooted in empathy for myself. You know,
love that.
Growing up in it, you know, I grew up in an environment where, you know, it's 8 people in my family been shot. You know, I currently have 2 nephews in prison. I have a niece in prison. My mother has 3 sons. All 3 of us have been in prison. All 3 of us have been shot. And so it's compounded in the family to the point where it's just like normal, right? It's like it's not normal to seek treatment. It's normal to self-medicate. You know, it's normal to just act as if this is how life should be. You know, this past July, my brother was murdered, you know, and I remember going home and trying to resolve these conflicting experiences. And one being that it was hard for me to grieve because I still carry the guilt of having murdered somebody else's loved one. And so I'm there as the leader trying to guide everybody while trying to resolve these conflicting emotions. And so the healing journey is deep and is profound, and it's not just me. You know, what I try to get people to see in these stories is that when you think about the narrative around black men, especially young black men and young brown boys growing up in these communities, and we're like, we can't penetrate their emotions, we can't get them to open up, we have to understand like the levels of trauma that you have to peel back.
Yep.
And so I'm a big advocate for mental health treatment and you know, journaling and meditation and mindfulness and all the things that you know really get us on that path to healing.
And writing has seemed like it's been a key ingredient
Absolutely.
in your personal transformation. And what I love about this book is it's almost like you're encouraging the reader to also begin their own process of writing.
Absolutely.
What is it about the process of writing that really allows you to heal?
Yeah, for me, it's almost like my accountability partner.
Oh, interesting.
You know, it's like
okay.
once I put it on paper,
right?
I'm
You're like,
in it,
okay,
I'm in this thing.
I wrote it.
Yeah,
right.
It's that thing. And then it's the process of putting one step, you know, and on any journey, you got to take a step.
Yeah.
And to me, each word is a step, you know, and it gets us closer and closer to our authentic selves.
Yes.
And, you know, while I don't think everybody should go off and be an author, I think that we should memorialize our moments. We should, you know, really uproot the things we've experienced so that we can really see them, you know, see them clearly, get them out of our head, all the words that's jumbled in our heads, all the narratives. It's kind of like you're able to string those things out. And once you can string them out, it makes more sense. It's like that ball of yarn, right? It's like all tangled, but once you string it out, then you can see things a little bit more clear. And I think that's what writing does, is it allows you to walk through a journey. And it doesn't always have to be like, you know, about your personal life.
Sure.
You know, if you're developing characters, you're going to show up in those characters, the way that you think, the way that you feel, what you hope for, what you dream for. And so it's just a great gift of freeing yourself, you know. And so to me, it's been the most therapeutic tool I've had at my disposal.
You talk about free. And one of my favorite letters was freedom is my legacy. You know, I'm all about, you know, freedom. I got a tattoo, live free.
Absolutely,
you know?
absolutely.
So before I want to read this section, but I first want to ask you, what does freedom mean to you? Or what's your definition of freedom?
Yeah, you know, freedom is so, you know, multi-layered for me at this point, you know. But when I get to the core of it, is to be uninhibited by false narratives. You know, when I think about how I grew up and the stories I was told about who I was, what my future would look like, what I was capable of, what I would be limited by, and, you know, to be able to break those shackles and to be able to wake up and know that I can decide and choose what my life experience is. You know, that's the ultimate freedom to me, is really getting into that more granular level of like, what is the story you're telling yourself? What keeps you in prison? And when I was incarcerated, I knew I was free before I ever walked out of those doors.
Wow.
And it was like understanding the power to think into existence what I wanted to manifest, and knowing that it had worked in a negative, and if I just shift the focus, it would work in a positive. It was the most liberating thing I've ever experienced. And like unquestionably, the way I move through life is a matter of how I think, and that thinking is rooted in understanding that no matter what happens to us, no matter what we go through emotionally, physically, we have a choice in how we respond to it. And as long as you don't allow anybody to take that choice away, you'll be as free as, you know, as possible. You know. So.
I love what you're saying, and I don't want it to. I mean, it comes across so smooth. You know, the way you talk, it's just so smooth. But I want to make sure that we just take a moment to acknowledge what you just said. When you were incarcerated, locked up, technically not free, you mentally were able to get free.
Absolutely.
So you did not allow your environment to dictate your mental state.
Absolutely.
That is powerful, because so often, you know, we're in a world where, you know, we respond to what we see.
Absolutely.
And we allow what we see to then dictate how we feel. So in order to transcend your environment, you had to go to a different place mentally.
And it was no easy journey.
I bet it wasn't.
No, it was a lot of you know, learnings along the way. You know, a lot of things that challenged ideas and a lot of reckoning, you know,
Sure.
and coming to like those deep moments of solitude, not just in solitary confinement, but internal solitude where I really was able to sit in
Yeah.
my being, you know, and question. And a lot of that came through journaling. You know, when I first started journaling, that's what led me to actually writing. But I was just so tired of being tired. And I was just like, you know what? I have to figure out, how did I land here?
Yeah.
Like, and it's crazy. Like, I was reading Socrates' The Apology.
Yeah.
And he talked about the unexamined life. And I was like, you know what? I'm about to examine my life. I'm about to see what happened here, right?
Right.
And so I started journaling. And I started being, like, radically honest about the things that had hurt me, that had damaged me, who was responsible, the things I was responsible for. I'm a big on accountability. And that was like, whoa.
Yeah.
You know, this is liberation right here. I could speak my truth, and then it led to me being able to be honest with the people in my life. You know, like being honest with my mother, being honest with my dad. And to me, that's like those shackles just began to dissipate.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, I have not been incarcerated, but I've also discovered the power of writing.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, growing up, being that middle child and you know, losing my father, you know, I kind of started to live a very performance-based and achievement-based life. You know, as long as I was achieving and people were patting me on the back, it's like, oh, good job.
Yeah.
You know, but what I realized is that I had created a persona, and the person of DeVon wasn't free. And it was really through writing, you know, and writing these books and putting my thoughts to what you're saying on paper, that began the process of liberating who I really was. Because that character we create to survive
Absolutely.
is so strong unless we examine how did we get here.
Yeah.
A lot of times those patterns keep repeating themselves.
Absolutely.
There's a piece I want to read in the book from your letter, Freedom is My Legacy. You say, Dear Jay, it's been 10 years since I walked out of prison a partially free man. I say partially free because there is no such thing as full freedom for a man who has served time. Please expound on that.
Yeah, so in that letter, you know, it's you know, really explaining to my son where I'm at in life, right? So it's like people see the success, they see the you know, the achievements, right?
Yeah.
It's like the achievements, and they're like, oh, life is great, life is free, right? But systemically, there are so many barriers to reentry. And
For those that have been incarcerated.
For those that have been incarcerated. Okay. And the barriers are just, I mean, there's 40,000 collateral consequences for having a felony on your record.
40,000 collateral consequences for having
a felony
on your record.
Yeah, and not even going to prison, but just having a felony itself.
Understood. Wow.
And the way that it impacts life. You know, the things that you don't think about. You know, when I talked about being free while I was inside, I only had me. When I came home, I had a family.
Yeah.
And so it was almost like there were moments of being reincarcerated by a system that impacted their life.
I see.
You know, so it's like you can't get home insurance, you can't get life insurance, you can't get, you know, jobs and housing and things like that. So it was like all these things constantly fighting against. And even at this point in my career where, you know, I'm pretty successful, I'm not restricted in how I live my life, so to speak, right?
Sure.
I got the means and resources, but I'm an anomaly in that way, right? Most people don't have the means. And so some of the things are not as restrictive, but they're hurtful. And I'll give you this story. I was traveling back. I went to the Dominican Republic with some friends of mine. Traveling back, we didn't fly together. We flew separately, and we were going to different destinations. But on the way back, one of my friends, she's an incredible, dope sister named Erin T, Detroit sister in Silicon Valley. She was headed to San Fran. I'm headed back out to L.A. And we fly into Miami, and she's going through TSA, you know, global reentry, and I can't use TSA because I have a felony, you know. And so, you know, I'm telling them, like, yeah, go ahead. I'll be there, you know, soon. I didn't make it back to about an hour and a half, you know. Wow. And when I got on the other side, she was in tears, you know. And in the grand scheme of life, that's not that big of a deal, at least from my perspective.
Sure.
Until I seen the impact it had on a friend who was sitting there like, she knows who I am. She knows me as a person. Why is he impeded by something that happened 30 years ago? And so that affected her emotionally. And so that incarceration where it's affecting the people that you love and you care about and you spend time with, it wears on you. Early when I came home, it was so frustrating to try to figure out, an apartment when I have a child to raise. And I want to raise in a healthy environment. And I'm being told because of a felony, we can't live in this area. And at the time, I'm teaching at University of Michigan and fellow at MIT Media Lab. And so I had to go above and beyond to prove that I'm worthy of paying, this little bit of rent. So it was things like that. And then mentally, those challenges that came up where I thought I had escaped the trauma. And it's like, bam, they smack dab right back in my face. So
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a very complex, and a truth. What I love about what you're saying is a lot of times people don't really think about, the truth of what incarceration is and the impact it has not only for those incarcerated, but for those that love them and for their family and friends. There was another part in the Freedom is My Legacy letter that you wrote. Jay, this is the complexity of being a parent. Sometimes we can be seduced into thinking that our dreams of making it, whatever that means, our successes, our accolades, and triumphs, are the best gifts we can give our children. The truth is, that's just what my friend Dr. Shafali calls parenting with our ego attached. Our entire culture tells us that that's what parents are for. To be our heroes, running into fires, making money, getting the corner office of the record deal, winning at life. But the truth is, parents just need to be there for their children. They need to stop what they're doing when their child talks, and they need to listen.
Absolutely.
When I read that, I almost threw the book across the room. It was so good. Because what I love, man, is I'm all about trying to deconstruct these personas, right?
Absolutely.
Because so often we're thinking that it's the persona that's going to lead us to where we need to be, but what people need is truth.
Absolutely.
And children, it's like when I look at my mother is without a doubt, a superwoman. The moments that spoke to me the most were when I could see her vulnerability. When I could see her truth, when I could see, even as a kid, oh, wow, there was an exchange I had with my mom where I was expressing to her, I was a teenager, in teenage, you don't know nothing.
Yeah.
And so my mother, after my father passed away, she raised me and my brothers, pretty much by herself with some help from my grandmother's 7 sisters. But on the day-to-day, my mom was taking care of us. And so one day, man, I was just frustrated. So I tell her, I'm like, yo, you don't even know anything about me. And she just bust out crying. And what she said was, at least I kept you.
Ooh.
Right. And what she meant was her mother had given her up when she was a baby to be raised by her mother. So my grandmother did not raise my mother for like the first 11, 12 years of her life. So when my mother became a parent, her version of success was, I kept you. But for me, I just saw mom as kind of this stoic figure. There was not a lot of vulnerability. And so I just thought, oh, you don't know me.
Right.
But mom was like, no, we're a success. You're here.
Right.
But I didn't understand that until I got older to say, whoa, that's what she meant. And to really appreciate that moment of vulnerability.
Absolutely.
To see her be so devastated and hurt by my ignorance as a child. What I love about this is that you're really helping take away the veil of the presentation of what it means to be a parent and a person. What is your definition of success? What is it that you want your children to learn about success?
Yeah, I think, now when I look at, specifically like my younger son, and I look at how we experience life together. And I think about, when he was first born, I'm like, oh, I can't wait to get him all the flat sneakers and, the things, right? It's the performative, it's the achievement, it's the metrics of success and whatever our things are, right? And he couldn't care nothing about that, And I remember where it really struck me, buying him toys, and he would discard the toys and play with the box.
Wow.
And it was just like, okay, this is a thing, right? Yeah. And what I realize is that for me, success is the time we spend.
There it is.
And how we share that time. In those moments where, I'm laying on the couch and he just comes and dives on me, And I made a joke about when the pandemic hit, And probably 10 times in a row, you're like, Dad, watch this, watch this. And he just spins around. I'm just like, if this kid spin around one more time.
One more time.
Right. Right, but it's in those moments that the deepest joy is felt.
Yeah.
Because I can see the freedom in him, you know.
Yeah.
He's always running through the house. I just observed this recently. As like, me and my girlfriend, we were talking, and she's like, you know, do you notice how Sekou like runs to do everything? And so it's just like a heightened awareness, and I was like, he's just on the move. And he's happy. He's full of joy, right? The joy is moving him from one thing to the next, right?
Yeah.
And I love it, you know, and I don't disrupt it, you know. I don't be like, hey, stop that running. Like, no, run, son.
Yeah.
You know, run. Do what
Yeah.
you need to do to be free. And so that's success to me, you know, at this point in my life is like knowing that I can show up as my full authentic self and that he can see that, you know, in real time. It's like, you know, Dad is sad today. You know, this thing made me sad, and there's tears that accompany the sadness. And he can see that, and he can stand in his own sadness. You know, when Dad is joyful, he can see that, you know, and it makes him feel joyful, and it gives him that freedom. And so for me, you know, that's what it looks like with him. With my older son, it's being able to stand in the moments of silence and knowing that that's where our love exists at. So we'll call and we'll talk, and it can seem, if you were out on the outside looking in, it seems very awkward. You know, it's, hey, what you doing, what you up to? Silence, you know, for minutes at a time. And we're just there. And I realized that the freedom is in the ability to be present in that silence and know that that's where my love exists at. And that's where his love, and that's where we're figuring out how to connect, you know. And it's complex, you know. But I know in that silence, when he's on the other end and I'm on the other end, and we're just there, it's love, you know.
Wow.
And that's, to me, that's success, is figuring out the spaces where love exists.
I love that. I love that.
Yeah.
Now, I'm going to be honest with you. Going back to Sekou,
Yeah.
there was a lot of love when he appeared with writing in black Sharpie on his and when you write about him writing on his pants and you call him, I'm like, wait a minute, that's a lot of love. You gonna let your brother tear up his pants with a black Sharpie, man?
Yeah.
But you were okay
Yeah.
with him expressing himself.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that was one of those moments where, you know, it's so funny now because I think about, you know, I talk a lot about egoless parenting. And, you know, I grew up where, you know, you have to be well-mannered. You have to tuck that shirt in. You have to have that thing on, and your shoes have to match, you know?
Yep.
And, you know, as I began to really evolve my understanding of what it really means to parent in a way that's healthy and whole, it's about, you know, our kids come here whole. You know, they come here as full human beings, you know, and they're no different than us. Like, we're still growing. Every day we're growing, so they're still growing. They're still evolving, but they come here whole.
Yeah.
They come here with all they need to exist in this world. And so what I realized is that a lot of the things that I experienced wasn't about me. It wasn't about whether I looked good in that suit. It was about whether how I was dressed in that suit made my parents look good. And so when I thought about the whole, you know, thing that he wants to draw on his clothes, I don't have to wear those clothes. What they got to do with me, right? That's him. He's a kid. He wants to be an artist, and he wants to tag his clothes up. He wants to wear, you know, mismatched shoes. As long as it's not going to deform his feet, like, those are your shoes. You got to walk out into the world and deal with whatever is said or how the people respond, and you can choose not to deal with that and just be in your world of happiness because it makes you happy, it makes you joyful. And so I'm just like, yo, you can tag it all up. Just don't tag mine now. That's a whole different thing.
Right.
But, you know, what I found is it brings him so much joy to create and to, you know, do things his own way. And he's wearing mismatched socks, and, you know, he got a bathrobe on with a hat on, and, you know, he got just whatever, you know, because it's just like, you know, he's a kid. He's like, all these things are magic to him, right?
Yeah.
And none of them mean anything to him in the way that they mean to us. You know, kids don't come equipped with all these arbitrary imposed ideas of what they think the things should be. And so getting out of their way and just freeing them up to, like, not have to overthink and overanalyze and be like, can I do this? Can I not do this? I believe in creating the least structure, because I believe that what I've witnessed with him, it just made him way more accountable and way more responsible because he's able to choose how he navigates the world. Like, he doesn't have to ask permission to go eat. He self-regulates. He knows if I'm hungry, go in there and get food, right? Don't eat a whole roll of cookies, though. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
And so he'll come to me and he'll say, Dad, you know, I had one sweet today, so I'm actually going to eat, some tomatoes. I'm gonna eat some, grapes. And so he self-regulates in such an amazing way, and it's beautiful. It's beautiful because he doesn't have to walk on eggshells or try to figure out the world in this very complex way when he's already been given agency. And it's a beautiful way of being.
Man, it's a very beautiful way of being, and that's why I love this book, because it allows anyone, whether they're a parent or not, to get these ideas in their spirit.
Absolutely.
Because what you're saying is so important. In Adlerian philosophy, it's really built on separation of tasks and understanding what your task is when somebody else's task is.
Absolutely.
And resisting the temptation to impose your will on someone else's task. So I love what you're saying about the dynamic with Sekou.
Yeah.
It's like, no, those are your shoes, those are your pants, this is your body, and him learning what works for him and you just being there as a guide.
Absolutely.
That's really, really powerful. And I love this book because that's what this book does. You're not trying to impose your will on the reader. You are, through the writing of so many letters, allowing the reader to then say, oh, okay, what's my task here? Oh, I could be more loving. Am I really free? If I'm a parent, am I bringing my ego into this? How do I deal with this? This is one of the reasons why I love this book so much. Here's another part that I thought was fascinating. In the letter, freedom is writing your own narrative. Hatred is everywhere and always will be. But there's one thing that can defeat hatred, and that's hope. When you write your own narrative, write it from a place of hope. As someone who has experienced some really hopeless days, how did you find hope to the degree where you could write so clearly about it?
Yeah, it came in many forms for me. I think back to some of the things that I read early in my incarceration, and I have to give homage to the elders who raised me, the OGs, the older brothers who I met when I was incarcerated. They saw something redeemable in me long before I saw it. And so these brothers, man, they challenged me. They challenged me with books.
Yeah.
And I was really fortunate to be literate. Literacy isn't that present in prison in a way that we would hope for it to be. But I was really, really blessed to be literate. And I remember them challenging me to read books. And initially I'm like, man, go on, I ain't got time. I'm thugging it out on the yard. I'm doing these things. And then they gave me Donald Gowan's Dope Fiend. And, this book was gritty, it was urban, it was like all the things, street, prison, chaos and disorder, and it appealed to where I was at the time of my life. And I ended up reading all of Donald's books. And it had deep social commentary. But it was, it was from the hood. It was urban. It was like some deep books and Iceberg Slim's Pimp and, all these books. And then those books ran out. And that's when they was like, you should read this autobiography of Malcolm X. And I was completely ignorant about who Malcolm X was. Thank you to our public school system.
Right.
But I was ignorant, but the name sounded so gangster. I was like, I got to read this. Like, you got an X on it. Right, got to be something dope about this. And that book was a transformative tool in my life in the sense that it really opened me up to, one, the possibility that you don't have to end the way that you started. And that you can turn around, that you can take agency over your life. And one of the things I don't think Malcolm is credited enough for is his intellectual capacity and his willingness to be a student of life and a lifelong learner. And so that inspired me to start reading philosophy and world history and just all the things. And the thing that gave me the hope was reading stories of people who had overcome adversity. Nelson Mandela, the thing for 27 years in prison for trying to fight for freedom.
Unbelievable.
And to do it with dignity. Yeah. And I remember reading, this poem that he quoted as one of his favorite, Invictus. And I'm like, whoa, this is how he's showing up in the world. Assata Shakur, her story of what she went through during her trial and before, she escaped. And just the adversity that she overcame, and W.B. Du Bois, and so many. And so memoir, like that memoir narrative, Maya Angelou, you got the shirt on. I know why the caged birds sing. I've read all of her books, right? And all the things she had to overcome and how she was able to give herself grace and she was able to find love and hope. So those books kept me hopeful, And, as I began to live life and just think about people who I'd met along my journey, and just, you know, people who had overcome things and had a perspective of life that was enriching and enlightening. And I was like, man, like if you can just hope for a moment, you know, that if you can get past that moment. I talk about this, like, for me, sometimes we live in two spaces we don't control, our past or future that hasn't arrived. But in the moment, if you can get through the pain of that moment and you can come out on the other side, anything is possible. And so that gave me hope. And of course, hip-hop is like, I'm a big hip-hop fan.
Yeah.
And I think it's the most hopeful, aspirational music, at least from where I began at. You know, it's all over the place now. But that music was a lifeline to me in prison, you know.
Do you remember what songs, you know, really gave you hope and inspiration?
Absolutely. So one of my greatest literary inspiration is Rakim.
Oh, yeah.
You know, a lot of people be like, oh, who do you study? Is it Baldwin? And I do, you know, have read and studied all those guys. But Rakim, to me, what he was able to do with words, you know, at the time, like, I mean, this is like the 80s, before people are even really thinking about complex wordplay in this way. I mean, him, KRS-One, I would just remember rewinding the tape over and over, like, did he just say that?
Yeah.
You know, and I would just be like, wow, like, this guy's, like, you know, talking masterfully. And then Nas, you know, I was about my third year in prison when Illmatic dropped. And when that album dropped, you know, we couldn't, like, just get it from, like, the radio. We had to read about, you know, what was hot or what was supposed to have been hot first in the Source magazine, then place the tape for the order for the tape, and then wait about a month for the tape to arrive.
Wow, okay.
So I probably got it way later than the rest of the world. But I remember laying on my bunk listening to Illmatic, and the song One Love comes on. And that song raised me up out of my bunk because he was writing a letter to his friend who was incarcerated. And that was so profound to think that at the age he was at that time, and you're making an album and you're thinking, let me write this letter to my friend who's in prison. Now, this was before criminal justice reform and people was talking about mass incarceration or any of this. This was a hidden society back then.
Absolutely.
You know, and so that song just resonated with me, and I began to listen to his work more deeply. And, you know, I think he's the greatest poet, you know, of our times, like, period, you know.
And what's the name of the song that you did with him?
Oh,
recently?
yeah. So the story of that, it was the wildest moment, right? Like, I believe in, you know, you attract into your life what you desire, what you want. This was one that was not on my radar. This was not on my list of things I want to accomplish in my life. But it came about, I was having a conversation with a friend of mine named Ben Horowitz. And, you know, I was telling him about this tattoo I got after I heard Illmatic. And it is by far the worst tattoo ever.
What is
it? It says the word Illmatic, but it's like ill on one side, matic on the other side. In between it is this dog that looks like a bear.
Oh, boy.
That's like chewing through a chain. But I got this done in prison. This is like before they got fancy. Like some of my tattoos are a little more fancy. But literally, it's like a hack job, right?
Okay.
And I tell Ben the story and why I went and got, you know, Illmatic, you know, tattooed. And keep in mind, this is like when the album first dropped. Nowhere in my mind am I going to meet Nas in the future, right? I don't even know if I'm getting out of prison yet.
Right,
you know?
right.
But I tell Ben a story, and he calls Nas. And, you know, and I shared with Nas, and I think this is something that's really important because I celebrate the way that I show up as a man. I think it's so important to honor people who impact and inspire your life. And I know sometimes as men, it can be different to say to another brother, like, man, you inspire me, you lift me up. You give me hope. I love what you do, and, you know, it keeps me going. And so I was able to do that, you know, and I shared that with him. And then we met some months later, and it was kind of like the casual, what up, you know, which is, you know, Nas is super chill for one. So, and then it was like we met again. It was like a little more, what up, you know. And then we ended up hanging out one day, me, him, and Ben, and we spent about 6 hours just listening to hip hop, you know, enjoying ourselves and having a conversation. Amazing. It's the most incredible experience because Nas is truly a fan of hip hop in the most honest way. And so it went from, you know, Ben being who Ben is in the world, me being who I am, Nas being who we are, to 3 teenage boys sitting around pouring over lyrics and going back to those moments, right? And then months later, he shoots me a text and was like, hey, can you, you know, write something for this song? He was like, don't rap. just write something for this song.
He's like, hold on, Shaka, don't rap now.
Right.
I just want you to write something.
I'm like, nah, like I got some bars.
I got you.
Right, you know. And so I write the piece. You know, first I was like, you know, when you need it. And he's like, I'm in the studio now. So I'm like, I'm all calm texting like, yeah, okay, I got you, bro. I'll shoot you something. So I hang the phone up. I'm like, yo, this is crazy. Like, what is he talking about? He need it right now. Like, come on, dude. Like, you know.
I need some time.
So I'm like, all right, pressure on. I go and write this piece, and I send it to him, voice memo, shoot it to him. And then I don't hear nothing for a minute, you know. And one day I'm on IG, and I see the cover to King's Disease. And I started laughing. I was like, wow, this is the same color palette of my book cover. And so I literally texted him, and I was like, man, this is crazy. I'm like, dope cover. And he was like, yeah, I can't wait till you hear our song. I'm like, what are you talking about, our song, right? Like, and I'm like, bro, you ain't even let me know it made the cut. It didn't make the cut or whatever, you know. And so the night it dropped, man, I sat with my son and my girl, and we just celebrated, you know. Wow. And at the time, she was in Chicago, so we FaceTime, and then we just, you know, we having a moment. But it's powerful, man, to come full circle in that way, and, you know, just the beauty of words. That's the beauty of writing. You know, it can take you in places that you haven't even imagined for yourself, you know, and that's what that was able to do.
And it's also the power and the magic of hope.
Absolutely.
That idea that you're in your bunk and you listen to Nas, and that hope that rose up in you. And then that hope became, you know, almost like a magnet, you know, that ultimately aligned you all for a meeting that you never knew was going to happen.
Absolutely.
But that hope set it up, which is amazing. And so when folks that are listening to that song, when they hear this story, that song then will be a real symbol of hope, that all things are possible.
All things are possible.
To those who believe.
Absolutely.
Man, okay, hold on. I know we ain't got all day, but we can talk about this all day. Here's another part that I just want to make a hard right for a moment. Because the book, you know, again, man, this book it's heavy. So I want to do a hard right to the chapter, Love is Not Abuse, or the letter, Love is Not Abuse. And I do believe that, you know, transparency leads to transformation.
Absolutely.
And I believe that vulnerability leads to victory. And it's one thing to say those things. It's another thing when you read what real transparency and vulnerability looks like, specifically in this chapter. Where you are very honest. You say this: my earliest sexual experiences were with older women. They were damaging and devastating. I will detail them here so that you can see how not to be, what to avoid. My hope is that you will learn from what happened to me. First, why was it so important to include a letter about what happened to you in this book?
Yeah, you know, raising, you know, Sekou, you know, I see the beauty of innocence that's unmarred by trauma. And I had this moment, I remember when I was with my aunts and uncles, and they were watching Sekou play on the floor. And I just remember them keep on saying, man, he reminded me so much of you. He reminded me so much of you. And initially, it was flattering, because he's a dope kid, right? This is beautiful little ball of joy. And then I got angry, because I said to myself, if that's what I was, why didn't you protect that? Why? Why didn't you protect that? And so when I was thinking about this chapter, you know, I was thinking about the conversations that I've had with so many of the men in my life, and how our experiences mirror each other, and the impact it's had on the women in our lives, the way that we've objectified them, the misogyny, the abuse, the womanizing. And, you know, I thought about our music. Like, I love hip-hop culture, but I also have a very conflicting experience with it at times. Of course. The denigration of our women as less than, as objects and tools only for our desire. And I was like, what is the root causes of that? Like, how do we get here? And I hear us demonized, like, you know, I tell the story of us being, we're America's problem, we're each other's problem, we're black women's problem, you know, we're nobody's solution. And I'm like, let me get to the solution. Because in order for us to heal, you have to understand what has happened to us.
Love it, absolutely.
And so the stories when we would be talking about our conquests, you know, oh yeah, when I was 14, I was with Miss Mabel down the street. You know, she's 45 years old. You know, oh man, you the man. You the man for that one. Oh, I had my first oral when I was 8 years old. My babysitter, she was 19. You know, you the man for that one. But then you see the consequence of that. The failed relationships, the inability to be intimate, the inability to be vulnerable, the inability to have emotional connectivity. And what really brought me to actually writing about it was an experience I had when I came home. So when I first got out of prison, you know, I started Facebook, and all of the people from the old neighborhood flooded, and, you know, they're reaching out and blah, blah, blah. And initially I was like, okay, this is cool. But then I started feeling like, this actually isn't right. These people weren't there when I went through the toughest part of my life. So to give them that level of access doesn't feel comfortable. And there was one woman in particular, not only had she, you know, friended me, but she started sending me like these scriptures, you know. And initially, I didn't even think about it. I read it and keep it moving, you know. And then it just started troubling my spirit, you know. And I was like, what's going on here? And I'm like, oh, this is the woman who I had this sexual relationship with when I was a kid. And now she's coming at me with this kind of like, you know, every time I'm sharing something, it's almost like she's saying the scripture in a corrective way. And I'm like, you don't have I haven't given you that invitation,
right, or that authority.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so as I was unfriending people, I think she reached out, and I just was like, you know, I really have a question that I would love to, you know, ask you. And I asked her, like, what happened to her, because I believe something happened that makes her make that decision to where you would have a sexual relationship with me when I was a kid.
Yeah.
And she went off, you know. Yeah. Did somebody touch you while you were in prison? Are you feeling guilty for the murder you committed? Like, she went off in the most vile way possible. And I remember sharing the inbox with Sekou's mom. And I remember her reading, like, her reaction was like, dang, she going off in like a little chuckle, right? And I sat in it for a minute, you know. And I said to her, I said, you know, this is what happens with our boys. The things that are harmful to us are laughed off. I said, I have a proposition for you. Imagine if this was a woman on her healing journey and she encountered the pedophile who took advantage of her when she was a kid, and she asked that question and that was his response. And her face almost drained the blood. And I'm like, this is what we have to protect our boy against. Yeah. Is this idea that what happens to us doesn't matter because we're born male. And what happens to us doesn't matter because even when we find pleasure in it, it doesn't make it right. That's right. And that was the conflict that I felt as a teenage boy. Like, so all you want to do is be intimate. You don't know what you're doing, but that's what you want. And it's pleasurable. Yeah. And then it became a thing where it's like, oh, I know I can make this happen. Let me go talk to this lady and blah, blah. But as a grown man, understanding the responsibility of an adult and understanding that what I thought was me running game really wasn't game. It was just this sick, twisted, you know, reality of perversion. Yeah. I thought it was important, you know, to really tell those stories and to talk about even, you know, the story I tell at the beginning of that chapter when it's like when the first introduction. Absolutely. And that pressure that young boys are always up against to, you know, you got to make it happen. You got to get on. And we think about, you know, we think about rape culture. We think about what happens with, you know, date rapes and things like that. This heightened sense of pressure that you're not, you know, legit. You're not a man. You're not a male until you can, you know, conquer, you know, a woman in this way. And so I just think it's one of those moments where we have to have an honest conversation. You know, like a lot of this trauma in relationships don't come out of nowhere. You know, it's attached to things that happen early in our childhood. And I can tell you, like, almost every time I've read that in front of a group of men, tears. Yeah. Men are in tears because they're just not reconciling that experience in their own lives. And it's way more common than people would ever think about. And I'm like, we need to have that conversation.
Yeah, I mean, this particular letter was just powerful to read because as men, we don't have these conversations. We don't talk about, hey, how did you really feel about, those sexual experiences?
Yeah.
What really is your heart telling you about what you went through?
Absolutely.
Because every time, especially growing up, it's like, oh, if you're having sex, man, you good.
Yeah.
And how many?
Yeah.
And how
Yeah.
often?
Yeah.
So it's about the frequency, it's about the volume, but never do we as men get a chance to really step back and assess the emotional
Absolutely.
damage and the emotional impact of like, well, did I even want to do that?
Yeah.
What was that even like?
Yeah.
And I love that you took the time to write this letter, because I do think that this letter in particular, and in the vivid detail that you open up your heart and you share your pain and your experiences around sex and the abuse that you experience, I think that this particular letter is going to transform a number of lives and also make it okay
Absolutely.
for us as men to tell our truth and have a safe space.
Absolutely.
And that it's all right for us to be honest and say, you know what, I went through this.
Yeah.
I've been through some stuff. One last thing, because I know our time is almost up, man. And like I said, I could talk to you all day, my brother. This part, I also highlighted because it just, touched me as someone who, lost my father. You wrote, this book is inspired by my father, James C. White, whose letters during my 19-year incarceration comforted, inspired, and challenged me to evolve into the man I am today. I dedicate this book to the sons of society, including my two sons, Jay and Sekou. What would you say to somebody out there, who is struggling, they're in a moment, they aren't sure where to go? What would you say to lift their spirits and maybe point them in the right direction?
Yeah. When I wrote this book, I just thought about my dad. I thought about the incredible man in my life. I thought about, my sons, my uncles, and the many struggles and many obstacles we had to overcome, And what I would say is that you are worthy of love. You're worthy of happiness. Excuse me. You're worthy of happiness. You're worthy of joy. We don't get enough space to have joy, and we're worthy of fulfillment.
Yeah.
And if there's anything you want to go out and conquer in the world, it's like the space to have those things in your life. And I don't believe that our journeys end where they start. Every moment, not even every day, not even every second, every minute, every moment is an opportunity to recreate, to reimagine, to rebuild the things that you believe that you're worthy of, So that's my mission, With this book, the thing that I'm probably most proud of is the, the cover, man, because it's actually my dad's handwriting.
Was that right?
Yeah, those are letters from my dad.
Wow, those are the letters.
Yeah, the second one is a letter to my son from me, but the other ones were letters from my dad.
Amazing.
And to me, that's the most hopeful thing, man. Is sitting and listening to the men of your life and letting them tell their stories unimpeded by judgment or correction. And I promise you, it's a life-changing experience.
Wow, man. Well, thank you, because you're a life-changing experience.
Appreciate you, man.
It's amazing all that you've been through, all the pain, all the challenges, all the trauma, for you to use your own life and your journey and open up your heart to love, to be honest, and to be free. I pray that one day this book will be in a time capsule, and that when history looks back, they will say it was these letters that helped our generation survive, thrive, and truly live free. My brother, thank you.
Thank you so much for that, man.
You got it.
Appreciate that, bro.
Absolutely. We have
My
to
God.
affirm, man.
Man, absolutely.
You pour so much out, man.
Man.
Got to put it back in you.
Absolutely. Appreciate that,
Keep
bro.
going, man.
Thank you, man.
As my old pastor would say, man, keep your hand on the plow.
That's right. Gotta keep your hand on the plow.
And we just want to say thank you so much to Live Talks LA and Ted for allowing this opportunity for us just as brothers to have an intimate conversation. We want to change the narrative about black men in this country, in this world. And our brother Shaka is starting a movement. Letters to Sons of Society. If you don't have it, you got to get it.
Thanks again for joining us. Thank you, Shaka, and thank you, DeVon, for joining us at Live Talks Los Angeles. Again, Shaka's book is Letters to the Sons of Society, a father's invitation to love, honesty, and freedom. It is available wherever books are sold, and signed copies are available in the link below and in the comment section. Thanks, and as we like to say around here, please go on gently.